Welcome back, Prashant. The last conversation we had, we uh, kind of seemed to go toward a perspective of first principles and looking at what our ethical being actually is. What reflections have you had since our call, and where would you like to start?
Well, I was wondering about ethics as a sort of internal evolution from first from an act of compassion um, and evolution to an actual ethic.
Hmm.
I was also thinking in terms of ethics, in terms of achieving balance and harmony within, rather than a sort of good and evil sort of thing.
Mm.
um, Both within and outside. And when I think talk balance and harmony, I talk in terms of sort of achieving the golden mean,
Hmm.
keeping things in a state of perpetual balance, harmony, and eliminating all disharmonies. And finally, one of the things we didn't cover was the role of intention in
Hmm.
determining whether an action is ethical or not.
Mm.
So so, for example, is it okay to lie to achieve a good end?
Hmm.
See if your intent is to achieve a good end and
Mm.
one that benefits everyone,
Mm.
rather than, or rather than tell the truth, regardless, and cause pain, and probably worse. And but equally, it's sort of well, when you have a terminally ill patient, and you lie to them, telling them they're not terminally ill in the hope that they'll be positive and this could spur their recovery. Are you also, in a sense, preventing them from the opportunity to make peace with their situation and preventing everyone else around them from making peace in a way?
So taking that as a springboard, do you feel that I mean you personally and or society in general has a view that ethics is objective and there is an absolute right and an absolute wrong? Or are you 100% certain that ethics is purely subjective and arguably morality is an opinion?
I mean, I think if you sort of start with the first, you could argue that there are certain objective ethics and certain subjective ethics. Certain subjective I mean, are we now we need to maybe differentiate between ethics and morality, because morality is dictated by the tribe, whereas ethical behavior is something which I see an individual embarks on with a view to uh, attaining the best result possible, with good intentions, or so I think in certain yeah, I think there's that whole medical principle, the first do no harm principle. I think that that's got to play a role in determining an ethic. Are your actions harmful in any way? Are they beneficial? um and then sometimes maybe they have no result at all. In that case, what is telling a lie?
Hmm. There's it seems that there's a link there to the concept, the Indian concept of karma in terms of referring to an action, work, or deed and its effect on consequences. And
Yeah.
and that kind of principle of cause and effect is it seems to be something that you're speaking to there. And there's a very um, common misunderstanding I find in karma being somehow linked to fate or destiny or predetermination,
Yeah.
which is
Uh,
unlinked to that. So um,
it's got more to do with action,
that's right. And
right act.
yeah, so the right action. And so I guess on the long tail question or secondary consequence perspective, doing a short-term crime for a longer term saving. I mean, let's say if you see a crime happening the other side of the street and you're in a particular state where jaywalking is illegal, But to jaywalk enables you to stop an old lady being mugged. Is
Mm.
jaywalking less of a crime because
Mm.
you're doing it because of to save the old lady from being mugged? Or should you, by being an upstanding legal citizen, say, well, no, I'm not going to cross the road and jaywalk because I'm not at a lights intersection. And if I did, then I'd be committing a crime. And that crime is the first guidance that I need to uphold over and above my human nature to stop an old lady being mugged.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't go with jaywalking as the best example because I mean I don't even consider that to be a crime in the first place. So that would be a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned. Of course, I'd be completely useless in doing anything because I'm not. I mean, the notion of inflicting violence is something that's a little alien to me. Yeah, I do have the strength, but I've never been in a fighting situation before. So, you'd have two victims of a crime as opposed to just
So
one.
let me give you a different example. So if someone broke into your house and you were with a loved one, family member, partner, whatever, and someone broke into your house and they were threatening to kill your partner or your family member, um, would you commit any form of defense, even if that defense was committing a crime in doing so to save your partner?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's non-negotiable as far as I'm concerned. I mean, you do your best to stop someone from generally taking a life. I think because that's where an ethic is being breached. You're
What about if you were to take a life in doing so? In to protect your loved one, would you take a life?
Yeah, well, I mean, if that person, I mean, I think the situation would have to be a lot cloudier than this. I mean, I think because if someone's actually committing a crime, and they are the ones who initiated this, and they, yeah, I think that's also sort of no-brainer. I think it would have to be something along the lines of my loved one being the criminal
Okay.
and or something like
So your loved one's a criminal, and the police arrive and they say, um, do you know if your partner has been committing crimes? If you say yes, they go to jail. If you say no, you're committing a crime of aiding and abetting. But it means that your loved one doesn't go to jail and you get to wake up the next morning in the same bed.
well, this is one of those situations, there was that great Aussie rock band Hunters and Collectors,
Mhm.
and they had an album called Human Frailty, and my human frailty would show up. I haven't been in this situation, but I would, yeah, I think I'd have a hard time. I mean, yeah, there's no, yeah, I think ultimately we're all human, and I haven't been put in this situation, fortunately, so far.
Well, I'm wondering, bearing in mind that there is a school of thought that says that morality, and let's talk morality for a second here, against an ethic itself. So the school of thought goes, and there's a great writer for mission.org, a guy called George, who I follow quite well, quite a lot. He he would say that humans have a moral sense because of the biological makeup and that determines the presence of necessary conditions for ethical behavior, which is the ability to anticipate the consequences of one's own actions, the ability to make value judgments, so
Mm.
cost benefit analysis, and the ability to choose between alternate courses of actions. And he posits that we need to recognize, he says, that what feels morally right isn't always right,
Mm.
especially since moral right doesn't truly exist in his view, that we we need to recognize that our feelings are an evolutionary feature that don't come from a higher truth. We realize that emotion-based decision making isn't always the best cause, And being an active moral participant in society means admitting that our emotions are not infallible. And that
Hmm.
would mean that understanding that morality comes from which our emotions come from are based off circumstance and our circumstances. And those with opposing views likely come from different backgrounds with different upbringings and different circumstances. And if we were to acknowledge this, then we would start to treat morality like an opinion. And there's a counter view, well, not a counter view, but there's an adjacent view to that, which there's a brilliant paper piece written in Scientific American well over a decade ago now. I'll find it and link it in the description. I've given myself a task now to find it. But there was a piece, maybe 2012, 2011, and the piece said that babies as young as 2 years old, or young children as young as 2 years old, can recognize injustice and unfairness. Um,
Right.
and so because the and some of the tests that were done were with young children looking at a TV show where someone's giving out food and three people in the room get all the food and one person doesn't get any food. And you can
Hmm.
see that the piece suggests that this sense of unfairness is extraordinarily um, ingrained from being young, but not a preset genetic condition that we arrive in life with. But even that age, unfairness is understood from our circumstance. What's your view on any of that?
I mean, I'd believe it. I mean, I think I do think kids have a good sense of right and wrong. But I mean, what about does this exist in other creatures as well, other species?
Unfairness, yes, in terms of protecting pack, protecting tribe, protecting set, but the that's survive. It would appear to be more of a survival condition as opposed to something that is right or wrong. So the survival, and it's a great link actually that because back to the analogy of um, what if your loved one was a criminal, would you lie to protect them?
Hmm.
The our
That,
morality, our ethical judgments seem to be transient based on what the ultimate gain would be.
well, I mean, it's actually interesting that we should deal with this question because I'm actually at that point of the brothers Karamazov where the brothers Alyosha and Ivan are kind of dealing with Mitya's imprisonment, and of course, I mean, as it don't tell me who's the killer, but but I think it's interesting, but they're sort of dealing with these issues, and I think I find it interesting that Ivan's actually sort of willing to help him, even though there are suggestions that he believed that he's the killer, and um, Ivan is the one who's the rational one, or he's made out to be the rational one, but we don't really get to know too much about him
Yeah,
initially.
not yet. Yeah, so without any spoiler alerts, then, but nonetheless inspired by that point, it would appear that our actions, despite a tendency to want to believe in an absolute right, an absolute
Right,
correctness, are relative to circumstance. And
right.
and then I wonder whether or not there is if we impose with a small I, not a capital I, if we impose dogmatic belief on top of that, um, and impose a framework of an absolute right, an absolute correctness, an absolute way, um, would we then have some kind of disharmony between our human state that is failing, weak, fragile, and immoral potentially?
Hmm.
And I'm moving all the way through Kant, Freud, and Sanskrit writings in what I've just said. And then there's a duality where there is an absolute dogmatic framework of correctness. And that disparity is our human condition. And some churches would believe that we are destined, in fact, we are almost hell bent to sin if it were not for our ability to attempt to repent through our lives.
But then what about the psychopaths? I'll bring a real life example over here. From your native England, the Moors murders,
Mm.
from that happened just outside Manchester.
Yeah.
There's just thinking of that makes my God, I can't even imagine that level of coldness.
Hmm.
And
But with the psychopaths, one would say that their detachment from any form of morality is a uh, is a is a condition, a chemical imbalance that has, and this isn't to excuse psychopathy, but a chemical imbalance that means that they are incapable of understanding the the immorality of their actions.
I wouldn't know. I mean, it's a state I can't possibly relate to, that someone
No, of course.
do something in cold blood. But I mean, it would appear that it also, is this something you get trained to do? I mean, as a lot of soldiers put in positions of power suddenly seem to show these tendencies, don't they?
Yes, and one could argue there that if you were in a battlefield and you were protecting your nation, protecting your troops, protecting the thing that you're fighting for,
Hmm.
should you be looking down the barrel and thinking, how would they feel that this person I may be trained to defend against and therefore in this context kill? I wonder if they've got a family, and do they have a son or a daughter that's missing them right now? Or and if a sniper looked down the barrel and thought of that, one
Hmm.
could suggest that it could be suggested that that would be the most ineffective viewpoint to have for a sniper.
Well, I mean, this is one of the other texts we talked about the last time, the Iliad. It's
Mm.
people from two sides suddenly starting to realize that the other side's not that different from us. I mean, that's one of the key aspects of that entire text. One that, that's always happening. It's like, okay, we're all just stuck in this in this shitty situation that's completely beyond our control. Is it okay to say that word? The
You can say shit as much as you like. We're on Rumble. It's completely uncensored, thank goodness.
Okay. All right. So it's the so I think that's probably more of an I think that's more of a sort of idealized. I mean, in a sense, everyone is humanized in that situation. Even Achilles, who is shown to be the angry one, but eventually is able to empathize with Priam
Hmm.
at the end for the ransoming of Hector's body.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know. I think, but then you hear about all these, gang rapes by soldiers of local women and all that kind of thing. And that is psychopathic behavior. It's knowing that you're in a position of power and just because you've got the power, you do it. So that I don't think that's just a chemical imbalance there. Maybe there are some individuals who have some sort of chemical imbalance, but I think psychopathy is much more widespread than that.
It is. So on that example, there is in Freud's territory now,
Hmm.
and other thinkers, there is an argument that we're all killers. We're all we all have the capability for murderous rage.
Right.
And it is and I'm not even mixing metaphors here. I'm mixing philosophy intentionally. That we are that our struggle is to contain this inner fire that we all have, and
Yeah.
our social fit is a manifestation of our containment of our murderous rage. And a successful life is one that is so successfully containing our murderous rage that we are completely peaceful. So then there's that standpoint, and then the more ancient traditions, let's say, would argue that even a murderous rage is born of a, a lack of unity within a mind-body-soul connection, and the disharmony that we have in our tonics, in our let's say energy centers, is the thing that would cause such rage. Whereas if we find harmony throughout our energy centers, all there can ever be is silence, which is one step even beyond the Western view of peace, and identified with such statements as Om, for instance.
Well, but then we're talking about psychopathy. Is psychopathy necessarily about murderous rage? On the one hand, it would seem that's a clinically bereft of emotion. On the other hand, it's more of a sense of jubilation that you're in this position of power and can exert this power.
I wonder whether I think there may also be a kind of a separate definition. So if you look at a psychopath, the clinical definition is a person affected by a chronic mental disorder with an abnormal or violent social behavior, and
Mm.
and that mental disorder seems to be the clinical view of psychopathy. But I've always enjoyed the definitions between psychopath, sociopath, and narcissist in the car crash observer analogy, which is the difference between a psychopath, a narcissist, and a sociopath is, so there's a car crash that happens, and a narcissist who's caused the crash blames everyone who's watching and makes them feel as if they were to blame for the crash happening, and they should feel guilty about it. But no, they can save their guilt for them, but then make them feel guilty for the fact that they're saving them from the guilt for the car crash that they obviously had nothing to do with. But nonetheless, they've been now believing that they're completely the fault of. So that's the narcissist. And then we have the sociopath who causes the crash and absolutely revels in the complete dismay and heartbreak from the community. and their turn on is the utter uh, horrific outcome consequence as a society that comes from this crash. That's a sociopath. And a psychopath planned the car crash 3 years ago and is nowhere near and has no requirement to be near the car crash when it happens, let alone observe what the society outcome is, let alone blame the people around the car crash for it, let alone, and that's the complete detachment from the morality of it all would determine in this analogy the difference between a psychopath, a sociopath, and a narcissist. I've always enjoyed that analogy.
That is a good analogy. What about the type of personality, the person who uses their past pain to inflict pain on others, or to what is that? Does that fit into any of these categories?
One could argue that, I mean, I'm being aware that there is now, I mean, we've had over eight at the time of recording this on the 25th, 26th of August. There's been over 8,000 people watching the last 6 or 7 episodes of Ethics TV. So I'm now aware with the viewership that there may well be some clinicians and actual professionals watching this as opposed to us. So I say this with respect to the science, but there is an argument that says that all bad behavior is trauma based, and
Okay.
so if one were to look at Ian Brady, let's say Moore's Murder, or the
Hmm.
James Bulger killers, which I find, by the way, even though in an Olympics of distaste, I think
Hmm.
the what happens with the young child is in the at least in contention for the gold medals of non-genocidal maniacs. Um, the the trauma, if you look at those murderers and abusers,
Hmm.
seems to run true in what the childhood was like, what the parents were like, and I think we should not, however, then say, well, if you have a good upbringing, with a healthy upbringing, healthy family values, and a healthy environment, you cannot do bad things. That would be disingenuous. Equally, you can have a terrifically bad
Hmm.
upbringing and surrounded even by criminals and not be a criminal yourself. So there is no strict correlation between that nurture-based circumstance. However, it does seem to be the case, and again, I'm going to caveat this from a non-scientific perspective, but from an observational perspective, um, there seems to be a correlation between those that commit terrifically bad crimes to things inside their environment that you could piece together a story arc that resulted in them doing those bad things.
But then what about let's say some of the Europeans who went and fought for ISIS?
Mhm.
That's that sort of personality type. I'm sure quite a few of them were psychopaths at heart.
Yeah. And well, let's take the clinical definition of psychopaths with a mental abnormality, which, by the way, potentially is different than the soldiers that rape women in villages that they've wiped out. I'm wondering whether there's another part of this, and without wading into the misogynistic angles too strongly here, because I believe that we can only assess misogyny if we take it with misandry, which is the least reported side, which is the exact
Yeah.
opposite of misogyny.
Oh
Um,
yeah, absolutely. And you have to, you know, also some of these actions may not be murderous. They can be long-term emotional pain,
yeah,
or you know, it's that kind of. What about, for example, the extremely romantic ideologue who inflicts pain, you know, who makes life a living hell for the people around him because he believes in a certain ideology.
yeah.
You know, Karl
Well,
Marx being one. I didn't.
yes, and one could argue if one were, let's say, against the Catholic Church, one could argue that the Catholic Church is another,
Yeah.
or any form of religion that, I mean, if we look at this from the abstract, once dogma is instructed and followed, part of that is othering in and of itself. There if there is a mantra that states that this is correct, this is absolute, this is the way, this is the path,
Mm.
it is unlikely then for one to be um, completely open to an alternative viewpoint. If you explain to someone from, let's say, one particular culture that Jesus was the Son of God,
Mm.
um, that culture that does not believe that Jesus was the Son of God would find it abhorrent to worship this, and then the traditions that go around it and the celebrations that go around it in the calendar that we seem to be running on, the Gregorian calendar, which has specific dates that celebrate the birth of the Son of God.
Yeah.
To some that would be abhorrent. To others, it is the central point of their calendar.
But at the same time, the Orthodox tradition has a different birth date for the Son of God. There's also that fact.
Well, and there's other traditions that and religions that the supposed Son of God in the Christian viewpoint is a prophet, but not the Son of God. He's and I'm avoiding going into the Monty Python and saying he's not the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy, but the but the but so there is another ring when we are dealing with any form of ethical principles. I think we have as commentators, a somewhat, um, well, it's either a privilege or an awkward position, depending on your viewpoint, that one needs to be careful not to make absolute sweeping statements of what's right or wrong. Although one could say that killing people's bad, but then it turns out that killing people's not bad if you're doing it to protect your loved ones or your nation under instruction from either a god or a general in an army or a president. So it turns out that killing isn't always bad. Is committing sexual crime always bad? Well, rape was only considered rape inside marriage in the last 30 something years. Before that, it wasn't considered rape.
Hmm.
So that, in fact, if you spin forward slightly earlier than that, it was seen as the absolute right of the husband to take advantage in that way of his wife whenever he wanted to, because she was his property.
Well, I mean, it's that kind of well, how about this? I mean, obviously pedophilia is bad, but then what about marketing to underage children, extremely sexual clothes to underage children and that kind of thing?
Yeah.
And kind of, aren't you in fact drawing innocent young children into a culture of sex doing that?
So let's state that in a way that is alternate, which is sexualizing youth
You're right.
how aiding and abetting pedophilia?
Potentially could be. I mean, it could be part of a larger chain. It could end up in that kind of, because you've got chat rooms, and it's when you start pushing kids into this, and without any sense of structure or perspective or any ability to reason out their thoughts, and I think yeah, that could lead to awful, that's what leads to grooming, essentially, doesn't it?
It does. Do we feel that people under a certain age should not have agency of their own body to sexualize it themselves? Let's say there's a 14-year-old who says, I want to wear this tiny little mini skirt and lipstick and so forth. And is that only okay after a certain age? And before that age, should the parents be the guardians of what they do and how they dress?
I'm actually kind of in favor of a different approach, that the education system should, rather than, I mean, all these rules should be there as a sort of precaution, but efforts must be made to teach young kids how to reason, because kids have open minds. And I think you could easily, for example, teach the Socratic method to kids at a young age in school. I think they'd probably be a nuisance to their parents because they'll use this method on them eventually. But I think you don't have to make them read the Socratic dialogues, but you just sort of extract the technique, that particular technique of questioning, because the big problem here is the whole reams of information that kids are being bombarded with,
Yeah,
and they don't know how to reason with. So I think what we're ignoring a lot is the internal aspect of these things.
that's right. And I think that's where I was hoping we would arrive at. And
Hmm.
we've spoken around the edge of this rabbit hole around on this point for a reason. I feel that we're now at a more of a from an internalization of the philosophy as opposed to an externalized comparative nature. And
Or an imposition of from outside, yeah.
yeah, and in our last conversation, um, you spoke of we discussed the requirement of critical thinking and the beauty of critical thinking. I do subscribe to the thought that questionable thoughts and deeds of anyone
Mm.
is often linked to a lack of critical thinking. And if I were to be slightly more generalist about it, that it's inversely proportional. The increased display of irrational behavior, or immoral behavior, I should say, is
Mm.
is it is in harmony with a decreased amount of critical thinking and rational reasoning of understanding.
I would say though that another part of the problem is people don't actually understand what, even those that try to do critical thinking don't actually understand what it is.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the key aspects of critical thinking is objectivity,
Mm-hmm.
and people don't have that. I think what people do is compulsive thinking.
Yes.
Right. There's a difference between compulsive thinking and critical thinking.
Yes.
Or rather, I think a better word would be just compulsive doubting.
Yeah.
That
Yes.
would be a better
Yeah.
to describe
I think
it.
you're right. I think with the if we take critical thinking as a construct, which is the objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment. That's the what you would find in probably the Oxford Dictionary or the Merriam's Dictionary. But I think that there's the process, the discipline, the intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and or evaluating information gathered from or generated by observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, communication as a guide to belief or action is very different from a um, a knee-jerk, reactive, um, emotive-based feelings thought.
Right.
They could not be more different as constructs.
Right. Exactly.
And I'm of the Stoic view of this point that, well, actually, almost largely all most Stoic points to reveal some cards here, but from a Stoic's perspective, um, one looks at the things that are happening and accepts them for their being that they are, and can reason them interdependently without thinking, well, I don't like that particular part. I don't like the outcome. I only like outcomes that mean that I end up winning, or I only like
Right.
outcomes that mean that I end up being the guy that with the most toys. And that's when we start to become reactionary and emotively based thinking. Whereas from a critical thinking perspective, all there is input and stimulus, and then what we have is the ability to reason and choose response. We can apply our emotions at the later stages of that, but if we start with our emotional side of it, then it's highly likely that decisions we make are based on extraordinarily um, monkey brain preferences, which is, do I end up with more money, more food, more mates?
Right.
Do I end up looking better than someone else? And that those biases are extraordinarily basic and simple.
That said, I mean, emotions maybe not, but intuition definitely. I think there's got to be an element of intuition, because otherwise you're constantly going to go down this rabbit hole doubting everything. But
Mm.
there's got to be some part of you saying, okay, this is convincing. This makes sense. Uh, uh, that's it's not just, I think there's a lot of naysayers. There's a raven, Poe's raven in us, nevermore, that keeps coming up and saying, uh, oh, you just, some people think they're being objective by simply saying no.
I one in business, one of my, I mean, I haven't actually referred to much business in these episodes in terms of, but like traditional Western business practice, but one of my one of my least favorite personality traits in business is people who have made the name for themselves in a company as being the VP of no. And
Yeah.
they're, I remember I've shaken hands with people who kind of introduce themselves as kind of, oh yeah, I'm Bill, and they know me as Captain No around here. I tend to be the guy that sits and kind of questions everything. So watch out, J Mac. You know, be aware that whatever you say, I'm going to question. And I always say, well, I would love that. I would prefer people to actually have some form of argumentative structure
Hmm.
that brings us to an even better solution. When we're in a circle jerk of violent agreement, we don't learn anything. I've learned almost nothing from success. I've learned almost everything from the the failed experiments. And
Hmm.
I've also learned the most from people who have an extraordinarily different viewpoint to mine. That's when I then learn. I don't learn if someone goes, I'm completely in agreement with you 100%. I'm like, well, then what else is there to discuss? But nonetheless, when someone is has created their personality for being contrary, a contrarian,
Hmm.
because that's their identity that they feel comfortable with. All they need
Well,
to say is, "No."
I also think a lot of people associate contrarianism with skepticism.
Aha,
So I think that's the other thing.
differentiate those two
That's
from
the
us.
other aspect.
For the viewers,
So,
differentiate those two in your head.
skepticism would again involves objectivity. Contrarianism just means being contrary and just doubting everything.
Hmm.
Whereas skepticism is about trying to attain a level of objectivity where you can objectively see that something is right and something is wrong.
Hmm.
And, you can try and make the difference, distinguish between those.
Would we say then that skepticism is a natural inclusion in critical thinking?
I think so. I mean, I have a very different idea of reason as compared to what the popular idea of reason is. The popular idea of reason is that it's pure logic. Logic plays a role in that, but I think there's got to be that little bit of imagination and intuition as well that allow you to use that logic towards reaching conclusions rather than simply getting tangled into a cycle of doubt and
Yeah.
you know just going round and round doubting everything.
Okay, so there's a layer of intuition, a layer of gut feel when
and
it's
and imagination.
an imagination. Okay, so we have imagination and intuition. Um, Imagination, let's say, is the alternative scenarios of creative thinking in outcomes. Intuition is an inner based uh, uh, understanding of something without logical processes. Um,
Right.
would you say that?
Actually, I would define it in a different way.
Okay, good.
Intuition, in my opinion, is a kind of logic,
Aha.
but but a logical process that exists in the subconscious as opposed to the conscious. So these are the experiences of life that you've taken in, information, data that you've taken in, that's gone into your subconscious, as a result of which your intuition is developed. It's a sort of trial and error that develops intuition, is how I see it.
Okay, well, I can see that. I can see that definition making sense. The ontological definition, of course, is that it's the ability to understand something instinctively without the need for conscious reasoning. So
Hmm.
the without the need for conscious reasoning part
Hmm.
seems to link to what you're saying, because you have an unconscious or a subconscious reasoning that is as important as the conscious reasoning part. And if you use them together, then you end up being able to critically think of something
Exactly.
in a mix. Tell me where imagination sits in that then.
Well, imagination helps you take things to the next level.
Okay.
This is, it's kind of, okay, once you've figured something out, imagination is what helps you develop ideas.
Hmm.
You transform what you transform the knowledge that you've extrapolated or deduced using logic and intuition, and you turn it into an idea, and you turn it into a new paradigm.
Okay, so the requirement for imagination then in what we're saying is so taking imagination as being the faculty or action of forming new ideas or images
Hmm,
or concepts or of external objects not present to the senses right now. Um,
right.
and it's needed for the potential to manifest, or at least the potential to be constructed as a thought of our conscious and unconscious reasoning, i.e., our conscious reasoning and our intuition together
Yeah.
becomes a potential with imagination, is what we're saying.
Exactly, and it's sort of, for example, Einstein wouldn't have been able to take his field equations to that level if it hadn't been for his thought experiments, for example. And so I think, so I think you need intuition and you think you need logic and intuition to function, but you need the imagination to take things to the next level.
And so, do we posit, you and I, that if we were able to implement a different way of bringing the next generation forward,
Hmm.
or even actually this generation onward, it would be to put practice, or for us all to practice a more rigorous methodology of logical reasoning plus intuition plus imagination.
Absolutely. I think these should be the seed. These should be the foundations of any sort of education system. I think it this is what you should be teaching kids.
And so if
And
let's say a school teacher watches, listens to this and says, that's what I teach to my kids. I'm
well, I mean,
I do this already.
I don't know. There's probably some who actually do. We don't know. But I don't know. It seems to me that a lot of do they go deep enough into it? I mean, it seems that when kids reach that age, the problematic age of puberty, when they're confused and they're deluged with vast amounts of information, are they equipped to deal with those reams of information?
I That's a good question. And another question adjacent to that, which is linked, is let's say as a teacher, you're spending 20% of the time enabling a methodology of conscious and unconscious reasoning plus imagination, or logical reasoning plus intuition plus imagination, and 80% teaching them about the wives' names of Henry VIII and the battles of your particular country where you won, because it seems that education is geared towards battles where you win as opposed
Right.
to any others. Um, if 80% of it is that and 20% of it is what we're suggesting, then the effectiveness has to be correlated to the volume of time that you're using for education that is complete nonsense versus, oh, sorry, I'm being unfair, that is more traditional versus these newer approaches.
Well, I mean, uh, I think imagination is also associated with crazy conceptual, I don't know, some sort of conceptual anarchy. I don't know how to describe it, but uh, just dragons and aliens and that kind of thing, going off into some fantasy world, or that kind of, that's what the imagination is associated with, rather than as being a tool of your functional being, and as being an integral aspect of your functional being. And I think all these three could combine, could go into the development of your ethical system. But right now, it's just it's all about self-esteem and personality and all that sort of. I think these things are being given far more priority. There's this emphasis on being wacky, being imaginative is being wacky.
Mm. And that's interesting because I wonder whether there's, I mean, how rigorous are we about how imagination works and enabling imagination? I remember when I was at Guildhall School of Music in the UK learning to play the guitar,
Yeah.
when I was younger, my teacher was a guy called Bruce Knapp, brilliant guitarist, and he was teaching us how to improvise, which in
Hmm.
and of itself is arguably a oxymoron. He was
Right.
teaching us how to be uh, to paint outside of the lines, but the way that he was teaching us how to improvise was in a way that didn't feel as if it was structured improvisation, but
Hmm.
he was giving us a mindset rather than,
Right.
he wasn't giving us notes. He wasn't saying when someone plays a G, um, and you want to improvise, then using C sharp is unusual, but using a C, which is the fourth of a G, tends to make more sense. He didn't, that's not the way that he was teaching us how to improvise. The way he was teaching us how to improvise was how to link our emotional response, energy in motion, our emotional
Right.
response to the music that was playing through our fingers. And
Right. Exactly.
it was the mindset of that imagination as opposed to now imagine like this. And that resonated strongly. And most of my musical career is based on him.
It's an internal progression, isn't it? I mean, it's an internal progression, the creation of a narrative that you're doing. But, I'll bring you two examples on the opposite side of the spectrum of guitarists, since you brought up the music analogy. I was watching the Dire Straits live show Alchemy
Mhm.
recently, where Mark Knopfler was at his best. So Mark Knopfler is at one end of the spectrum. The other, I'd say, Johnny Marr of the Smiths
Mhm.
is another example of brilliant of how to do tight, compressed, very simple melodies,
Yep.
but that are difficult to conceptualize. I mean, you'd probably have a terribly hard time. So I think these are the two extremes of how you can, how imagination actually works.
Yes. Brilliant, brilliant examples of the different ends of extraordinary simplicity that's horrifically complicated to construct and
That's
very,
the hardest. Yeah.
yeah, it's I feel similarly to artists. There are certain artists, if you take if you take Jackson Pollock,
Hmm.
super abstract. My wife is an abstract artist, so I'm saying this with some observational understanding, but no technical understanding at all. But from mine, I'm talking about from an abstract point of view, it would appear to be utter chaos.
Hmm.
In Ex Machina, a very important film that everyone should watch, especially in this day and age. The main protagonist says to the co-lead, if you like, the guest in his house. He says to the guest in his house, "Look at this Jackson Pollock painting." Um, if Jackson Pollock was told any form of instruction, any
Hmm.
form of instruction at all, what would be the first thing what would have happened? And the guest says he wouldn't have painted a single stroke. And the requirement for the Pollock painting is that there is zero restriction on what's possible and what's right and what's wrong and on what's organized and what's not disorganized. Whereas there are some artists who, for instance, are like, let's take, for the sake of argument, any of the portrait um, painters. Um, if you take a Van Gogh or you take any of the people that are seemingly famous in the space, it their realism is a
Hmm.
function of their success of producing the art in a certain way, whereas the surrealism is the function of an abstract artist. And in fact, potentially disability would be if what they create in the surreal looks like it's now into the real. So
Right.
there is the either end of the experimentation part there.
Well, it's I mean, since we're on the subject of art, what about the Renaissance painters? They took things to the next level. I mean, it was just two-dimensional, one-dimensional painting before that, and they
Mm,
actually paint without any frame of reference. They figured out a way to make colors look real, like three-dimensional, like a photograph.
yeah.
And how did they do that without any point of reference? And that's
Yeah. And surely the answer is experimentation. Surely the imagination manifest through experimentation had to be the answer. I mean, there's plenty of experts who may be watching this who have lots of thoughts as to the narrative, the chronology of that. But from a
right.
layman's point of view, I imagine underlying it all was a boatload of experimenting.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine an artist suddenly, let's say Da Vinci, just getting up in a studio saying, I think I'm going to paint a lifelike picture today or something, and then just going about and doing it.
That's right. Although, and it's interesting with Da Vinci, some of his creations, specifically around motors, helicopters, um, are mind-boggling in the vision that one would have. And so now let's reverse psychopathy into genius,
Right.
a mental imbalance of a different sort. Is there an advantage that could be sought that is not something that is above the kin of learning? It is above and beyond the ability to structure a learning from that one, and maybe one could argue that this is uh, somehow genetic, that we are born with a talent that is beyond something that could be taught.
I don't know. I think a lot of this uh, could it just be the result of an open mind? That's the other thing you could ask. I mean, about just being open-minded to possibilities, to different ways of thinking. But or maybe it's the environment in which you were brought up. But then again, there's Mozart and there's lots of other composers, and Mozart was prolific at a really young age.
Mm.
And then there's also other classical composers like Schubert, for me is a brilliant composer. And but yeah, I mean, there's got to be something special. And in that sense, does that mean that if you're a genius and in the right sort of environment, you flourish? But if you're not in the right sort of environment, you get conditions such as ADHD and need medication to be controlled, or or dyslexia or that kind of thing.
Well, I personally believe that um, if not channeled well,
Mm,
neurodiversity can be extraordinarily problematic. Um,
right.
and it's whilst I welcome the volume of awareness around certain neurodiverse conditions, I'm concerned that people who inherit, no, or rather identify with having a particular neurodiverse condition, then
Mm,
feel as if because I am insert condition, that
mm.
means that I insert behavior. And we're inside a loop, and our choice supportive bias, no, I couldn't do that because I am X, Y, and Z. I see people arrive in meetings and they say, "Oh, well, yeah, sorry, I'm feeling a bit chaotic today, but that's just me because I am insert condition."
Yeah,
And
it's just a kind of, just go out and this whole nonsense yeah, just lack of structure, lack of definition, lack of clear thought.
it is, and also I feel, and I may upset some people through this statement, but I feel there is a significant amount of trying to absolve themselves from accountability. Now, I'm overwhelmingly concerned with the lack of accountability in society anyway. And
Or,
so,
or,
yeah.
or justify laziness.
Well, that's exactly that. So, um, when people say I can't get a job like that because I don't have that education, or because I was brought up in this society, or because I am of this particular mental persuasion or neurodiversity, as someone who was brought up from in any form of backstory no one could see as being opportunistic, and from being in various different calculations somewhere on the spectrum, which I think is an othering mechanism in and of itself. Um, I think it's down to choice, and I think that your work ethic and your choice of how you focus your efforts is and from a Viktor Frankl standpoint, that is where our freedom is. The gap between stimulus and response presents our opportunity to choose what we do with it. And man's search for meaning is about that point. I think it's an
Yes.
opportunity.
What about, functional autism? I mean, I can see when it's non-functional autism, but functional autism, is that really a thing, or is that just eccentricity or?
Well, from someone who is classed as being neurodiverse myself and arguably on the autistic spectrum, I would argue
I
that
could, I could be as well. I haven't had myself, but
I'm sure that we both probably are, but also I don't buy that there is such a thing as neurotypical anyway. I believe
right,
I believe that as soon as you class something as typical, it's the same as saying people with this color skin is what we're going to class as normal, and everyone
Hmm.
else is abnormal. And that there's
Right,
no difference between saying that about skin tone and mental structure. There's no difference. So I cannot currently in this time of recording, and I'm 51 years old. So ask me again in another 51 years. My opinion maybe have matured by then. But at the moment, I find it completely not believable that it is okay to other people as to a
right,
spectrum where there is such a construct as normality, because that
exactly.
immediately there's abnormality associated with that. Nothing good comes from that othering. Nothing.
It's also similar to essentially I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. That whole way of thinking comes from there being a normal idea of what a man is, or singular idea of what a man is, rather than there could be a whole spectrum there. You could have a spectrum here of different types of male behavior.
Yes, well, as had I've walked into several relationships in my life where I've had to somehow um, uh, advise that their ex-boyfriend isn't the way that all men are. But yeah, I think there is with gender, I feel that there's one part which is someone identifying as being cis or non-cis, i.e., standard or non what we would class standard, which is this similarly othering perspective. But the how people identify with that is one thing. On the other hand, there is a biological definition of a particular chromosomic makeup and particular aesthetic, i.e., the
Right.
presence or absence of particular um, sexual organs that suggests that in this scientific structure, you are a man, you are a woman, whatever. So,
Mm.
and these two things are separate. Someone can identify as being a brick wall without having the construct of being a brick wall. That's
Right,
different than whether or not they are empirically a brick wall or not. Um,
right.
and as Piers Morgan said to this particular spokesperson, and I apologize for viewers of not knowing this guy's name, is a black guy on the Piers Morgan show on YouTube, who was saying about anyone should be able to identify as anything, um, and therefore have the rights of the thing that they identify. And Piers Morgan said, well, okay, I identify then as a black man to this black man, right? And there's this meta uh, argument structure where you saw this black guy then facing the fact that this white, middle-aged, like pale male and stale journalist who identifies as a black man is a very, very problematic question set to a
You're
black
right.
man. It's hard. It's a hard question to answer. And the black guy said, you shouldn't make this about race. And Piers was like, we're not talking about race. We're talking about how I identify as myself.
Okay. Well, I mean, according to certain aspects of Vedic philosophy, I'm allowed to identify as God. That's my natural state. I am God. I am that. Whatever the source is. Of course, it takes a lot of work to reach that stage where you actually come to that sort of God realization of you being that. And by then, you're probably completely evolved and all that sort of thing. But
Well,
yeah, I
that's
think
yeah. Om so hum. I am that is
yeah,
a mantra that I probably chant 50 times a week in my daily yoga practices. So yeah,
yeah, exactly. Or to the question in the Upanishads, I think there was that Twamasi. To the question is, what are you? You are that,
yes,
and
yeah.
that kind of
And maybe in fact there's construct of Israel from the definition of the term, those that struggle with God.
Hmm.
Maybe in fact the struggle of our existence to some extent is the difference between us as separate and us as one. Um,
Yeah, exactly. It's yeah, it's a sort of yeah, it's not a it's the non-duality. It's a fascinating thing. I mean, how do you reach that stage?
yeah.
I mean, that's of non-duality.
Well, and it's a great question because you and I both know various different thought patterns that would
The Platonists also had something similar, right? The one, is it? Yeah, the one.
yeah, and the Buddhists would say that if we detached our self from a egoic sense of self, then we end up where we are anyway,
Yeah.
which is in the realization and the being, moving away from human doing to human being, and the
Yeah.
constructs of human doing, which are arguably based on loss aversion, which generates most of our actions. In fact, the amount that we are remorse for what we've lost, or we are scared of what we could lose, drives
Hmm.
things that result in greed, result in the requirement for dominion and control. If we detach that from our existence, what we end up with is just this oneness. Um, and I think it's the struggle, the ultimate struggle. What some could argue that it's the ultimate struggle of mankind, humankind, is this relentless pursuit of gain, which doesn't result in happiness. In fact, let me just even underline that somewhat more. It's a relentless pursuit of happiness rather than being happy in the pursuit.
Right. Exactly. I mean, it's yeah. I guess the approach to action could be like you try and become like a child playing, a child at play.
The childlike mind. We
Yeah.
we often, for those of you who watch and have read any form of Eastern philosophy, you will notice a beautiful pattern that Prashant and I have in our talks, because there is underlying this oftentimes an extraordinarily simple reasoning structure. And it
Right.
results sometimes quite commonly in a almost a counter-evolutionary abstraction to the simplicity of naivety and curiosity, um,
Hmm.
and within which there is the ability to learn and progress, versus being opinionated and egoic and selfish, versus being
Yeah.
self-full and mindful.
Right. Exactly. Know thyself, Northeast Uton. That the Platonic thing.
And a beautiful, I love that one. I also love that the sage points to the heavens and the idiots argue about the finger.
Oh, I've never heard that one before.
That's that's the yeah, that's one of I think that's one of my one of my favorites um yogic. I'm reading a lot about yoga. I'm reading a lot about the history of yoga, and the it's not to say it's an overlap with the ancient scripts is would be such an extraordinary misplacement of the importance of yoga. Um,
Hmm.
the 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 I'm as I get older, I'm using yoga for to stop inflammation and keep mobility. But paradoxically, I have become knee deep in the history of it all, and the explanation of this struggle of existence through the very basic difference between harmony and disharmony in ourselves, and how that
Right.
is exemplified through yoga.
It's, I mean, what's known as yoga, all the yoga classes and all that, it doesn't scratch the surface of what yoga truly is. And a lot of the yoga people are terribly neurotic. I mean, they don't seem to, well, they don't seem to have this harmony and disharmony. You know, I see a lot of them going off with their yoga mats to yoga class every morning, and I just keep wondering, can you have a conversation with any of these people about the nature of the self, or you know?
I'm going to be I'm going to be extremely generous here in the and detach my opinionated self from the answer, only to balance inside myself that how I feel about this. On one hand, okay, so I'm okay with where however we can all arrive at our mat. And if we
Hmm.
arrive at our mat through an inspiration through Instagram of hashtag yoga every damn day, if that's how we arrive at the mat, fantastic. If we arrive there because we think it's a great place to pick up chicks, okay. If we arrive at the mat because we're there because our physiotherapist said that it would be a good idea to get a good
Yeah,
stretch, fantastic. But if
right.
we maybe, I mean, I arrived at the mat because I had gone through a divorce that had destroyed my entire sense of self. And
Hmm.
I thought that very naively that yoga would be a place where I could somehow find a sense of what I was again. And that was, I mean, this was 10 years ago, but I didn't have a better reason to arrive there other than, well, when I go to the gym, I feel like shit because that's where I used to go with my wife.
Yeah.
When I go running, I feel like shit because I'm morbidly obese and it screws my knees up. When I sit at home eating pizza and drinking beer, I feel worse than I did beforehand because I'm now 30 kilos heavier. So I'm now just going to try yoga because I've tried everything else and because of the other reasons. So that's how I arrived at the map, no problem. And now I arrive at the map because that's where I reconnect with what this physical version of my existence is. That's what I'm doing at the mat. And I don't share that. I've never said that online or in any talks. I don't speak about it on stages. I've never written about it in books, but it has a profound impact on me. And
Mm.
it's become extremely, that's not even the word, extremely isn't enough. I can't be hyperbolic about it enough.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, it's
it's
where I connect.
yeah. I mean, I have this practice that I do well as often as possible, where you just sit in silence for a few minutes, and as you do the whole breathing in and out, thinking so hum, and once you're finished with that, you just allow yourself to drift inwards and into silent space, and that's one of those things that centers you completely. You know, there's all
Well,
sorts of very complicated meditation practices, but something this simple can be
you know what?
very
To be
centered.
honest, you just described pranayama,
Yeah.
breath, the importance of that. That pranayama that you've described is also therefore meditation, is also therefore the unity, which, by the way, of course, anyone who's watching who wonders what yoga stands for in Sanskrit is unity in and of itself, literally.
Mm.
And so there is, if it weren't for the fact that people can monetize really fancy applications on mobile phones, what you've just described is all that people need to know about meditation, of course. So there is nothing more complicated than that requirement. And also, when you're sitting there, if you're just sitting there, you're also doing yoga too. So you're now doing breath work, meditation, and yoga all in one. Done.
Well, it's just, I mean, and make sure you sit straight. That's all. You know,
That's right. Well,
that's
if your energy centers, if to align your energy and to contain that, and generate that beautiful breath,
Mm.
that's all you require. But however, people can also lie down. I find it more effective to harness that when I'm sitting straight. But I
Mm.
never used to. I used to I used to lie down because I just felt that sitting up was it was just easier to lie down. Now I realize that when I'm sitting up, I'm engaging things that I wasn't aware that were there to engage. And
And
yeah,
and this could be a starting point where you start experiencing this unity of which you were talking, and then you start empathizing. And with this empathy, you start building up that sense of ethics, which is organic.
I believe that. And we've arrived at the a beautiful understanding that I think we share here is that if we originated that at the core, literally, then the outbound ethical practices follow. And
Hmm.
if I could wave a magic wand, other than what I've said on record, I would remove comparison. Um, I would remove, if I could, I would remove our loss aversion, which is linked to the comparison, which is actually why we compare. But if I could wave that magic wand as a restructuring of education, I would enable people to practice yoga and critical thinking.
Hmm.
I would enable imagination to be rewarded and nurtured, and experimentation to be our learning principles. And
Well,
yeah, that's what I would do.
it exactly. I think such an education system was, you know, Rabindranath Tagore, the Indian poet.
Mhm.
He came up. He had, in fact, devised a sort of school and university that emphasized these things, and that also emphasized learning close to nature.
Yes,
And apparently, it still exists, or and apparently, students who graduate from that university are actually very well read and very learned, and
I have no
uh,
doubt.
uh,
I have no doubt. And if you add biomimicry into this, right, if you anyone who's watching or listening, whoever wants to understand how any form of organism, be it a country, a company, a sports team, could work more effectively, a deep dive into biomimicry, the structures of nature and the species inside it. That's that's the learning. If I could replace business schools with biomimicry schools, that's if you want to know how species interact and how hierarchies modulate and how parasocial relationships organize and how product can be productive in its creation. Nature is bizarre. We sit out, we can look outside, and all of the answers, and I'm ranging this across from medicinal answers through to
Mm,
uh, through to answers of how capitalism works
mm,
are there in front of us, free of charge. Right.
yeah,
That's what I think learning should come from.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's I mean, the basis has to be nature.
It does. And what you are, the first place of being in nature is to just sit there. So, like, if we break it down to micro first principles, sit,
Mm,
breathe, that's the start, then observe, then intuit and reason and imagine. And we've structured a way of being that can only result in a more productive, I think, more harmonious natural environment. And inside that, ethics becomes not even a philosophy, it becomes a natural outcome as a practice from its origin.
I think one of the things, I think in industrialized societies, I think one of the great taboos is boredom. We detest boredom.
Mm.
I think what we need to do is destigmatize boredom because it's because we of our desire to avoid boredom that we don't do all these things that you just talked about. That's I mean that's what people are just rushing, trying to do everything they can to not be bored.
I see it in a slightly different way, but not with a firm view. I'm wondering whether boredom in my head, where I see boredom is not that people are trying to avoid being bored, but
Hmm.
they we try and do more so that we can gain more. And we feel that if we did less, then we would be gaining less.
Well, I mean, I think though, are they really doing anything apart from stimulating themselves?
Well, I think that gain, for instance, in stimulating themselves sometimes in doom scrolling, let's say on social media, is is getting stimulus, because it triggers a dopamine receptor in our heads. That every single time we scroll down and the little word pattern happens, there may be new content, and even better, there may be a new like. Someone may have liked our post, and that gives us a little thrill, and so the self-satisfaction that's happening is is the thing. I don't think that it's because we don't want to be bored. I think it's because we are being triggered um, positively in terms of hormonally anyway, from our actions of scroll, 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 scroll. We like, hoping that people like us back. And people say to me, "Oh, you've got 1,000 followers on Ethics TV. That's amazing." And I'm completely of the mindset that you don't count the people you reach the people that count. I would love it if one person's life was positively benefited from this versus 1 million followers. That means nothing to me. It's nothing to do, it's not a volumatic game in my view, but nonetheless, I think that we live in a society that is a volumatic game.
But what about that person who they've got nothing to do, so they binge watch a show
Okay.
or that kind of thing, as opposed to, let's say, for example, just sitting on your balcony for 20 minutes and not getting bored in that 20 minutes just by the act of sitting and doing nothing.
Yeah, good point. I think there's, I mean, I don't know. I struggle with it, Prashant. I think that it's because filling in the blanks gives us a dopamine hit that
Hmm.
is that is so addictive, and I cast the blame here strongly toward big tech, by the way. But
Yeah.
but equally, the foods that we eat are so addictive. The refined sugars that we have inside them are addictive for a reason. And again, nature has the answer to this. Again, the foodstuffs that would give us the sustenance already exist for free in front of us.
It would be an interesting study to see the effect of The Simpsons on obesity and how watching Homer Simpson eat made lots of people eat as well.
Well,
It
every
turned into
time he said, "Oh, burger," people thought I like a burger too.
right. Well,
That's
I mean, people used to have strange health standards back all the way up to the 90s. I think I remember reading, Steve Waugh, the former Australian cricket captain. I remember reading his autobiography, and he was talking about how when they toured England and they went across the country by bus, they'd stop by and they'd buy Big Macs because it was considered healthy because it had lettuce in it, and
right.
that kind of things. These are professional sportsmen.
Yeah. Well, and Usain Bolt, before he set the world record, I think his entire diet for the 12 hours before was purely chicken nuggets. Um,
Right. I mean,
so I think really there is an an internal barometer. I mean, if someone once said to me, because I think I fell into this category. Someone once said to me, you know, if you're practicing functioning alcoholic, if
hmm,
this next question is problematic to you. And I said, go on then, tell me. And they said, you should be able to stop drinking 1 day a week, 1 week a month, and 1 month a
hmm,
year. And if that's a problem, if that
hmm,
construct is a problem, you've got a problem. And
right.
and it was a problem for me. I said 1 day a week, no problem. 1 week a month, and then 1 month a year, and
Yeah.
that's a problem. There's a problem. And if sitting on a balcony for 20 minutes is a problem because you'd be bored, there's a fundamental existential problem going on.
Exactly. I think. Wow. I haven't had a drink for nearly a year and a half now. So that's bad.
And
It's
I haven't had a drink for 8 day, 9 day, however many. For me, drinking stopped being coupled with
hmm,
my relaxation. When it
exactly.
when it was me at the end of the day relaxing through alcohol, that that was my pattern. Now, what I love doing at the end of the day is playing with my dog, and
Right. Brilliant.
and it's just switched.
Yeah. Could yeah. I mean, I keep wishing I had like a massive golden retriever running about my apartment. But unfortunately, that's too much of a responsibility. So
Yeah.
I'm taking that step yet.
Yeah, well,
And
yeah, and massive dogs in apartments is always problematic. But anyway, I think what I'd love to start our next conversation on is the point of the structure of an internal discipline, without it feeling dogmatic and without it feeling like it is somehow sacrificing happiness or sacrificing joy. And if we could start there next time, we've kind of arrived at that part of the rabbit hole.
but I mean, isn't that a lot of the bands are like that, aren't they? When they start off, especially, there's that internal driving force that kicks in at some point, and
Yeah.
you don't even the discipline just happens spontaneously, and
Yeah.
uh,
Well,
it's part of the
with yoga for me, I don't feel as if I'm keeping some kind of discipline. I
yeah.
just feel that when I don't do yoga in the morning, I'm not connected as much to what this physical manifestation is of this energy anymore. And so if I miss yoga for 1 day or 2 days or 3 days, I gradually move further and further and further and further away from being attached to what it is that I am. And I don't speak about it because I can't put words to the paradigm in a way that's being fair to it. So
Hmm.
I just say I enjoy doing yoga every day, but it's actually far deeper than that. It's way more profound than that. And if you didn't breathe, when you check into yourself and you just sit there and you just breathe
Yeah.
in and out, there's something that happens there that's beyond words, I think.
Well, I mean, I started going to the gym, I think, since March, and I just changed my attitude to the gym. I didn't turn it. I started kind of looking at how it was affecting me. I made part of a whole process, making sure I ate sort of I mean, I did the whole intermittent fasting and took long walks as well, and started watching how my body was transforming. And then it became in my mind associated with something larger rather than just a routine.
Hmm.
I just say occasionally I don't turn it into, well, I've got to go 4 times or 5 times a week to the gym. It's sometimes if I'm bored, I just don't go.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And why? And if you start forcing yourself to do something, that's a problem in and of itself as well.
Right, exactly.
Why would you force yourself to do something you don't want to do? That sounds insane.
Right. Exactly. It's that sort of thing. But again, there's that other thing, the boredom threshold. That's the other thing, right? When you're learning a musical instrument, you've got to go through this phase where you're going through 3 or 4 months just playing aimless 2 chord songs, one chord songs or 2 chord songs, and you're just really bored with it, but you've got to keep repeatedly playing that. And then when you think of, how easy a Mark Knopfler makes it look, and how easily the rest of the Dire Straits just backs him up so seamlessly, and how the hell, especially in his live shows. Have you seen the Alchemy performance?
Oh yeah, yeah. In fact,
That's
I saw it live. Um, and so
you
yeah,
actually you were there when
yeah,
it was you were at the show.
yeah,
Wow, that's amazing. And
yeah.
I think more than what his guitaring, I just wonder, like the drummer is awesome and the bassist, and they're all just very calmly reacting to what he's doing without any, with no effort at all. I'm just wondering, how's that even happening? I mean, they should all be stressed out and, ro-
It becomes like breathing. And I've been a guitarist for 40 years, and so yeah, it just becomes like breathing, and there's no it's not it's flow, and the flow doesn't require any form of anxiety or stress or effort. And even though
Hmm.
theoretically there's effort attached, you're burning calories to some extent, you're thinking about where to put your hands and feet, but the truth is it's a flow that is a wonderful wave. I feel the same when I'm speaking on stage most of the time. When I do a keynote, most of the time now, 95% of the time I'm in flow, whereas in the past it was 1% of the time. And so over the years it just becomes more and more easy.
Have you seen the Smiths live?
I never saw the Smiths live, which I kind of upset about because I was there. I was in that scene in the
Right.
late 80s, early 90s. I was in the music scene and around watching bands and I didn't never saw them. And I think that I never traveled up to Manchester to the gigs at the Hacienda and stuff like that. I should have, and I didn't. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that was an interesting moment. You had these indie record houses like Factory Records and Rough
Yeah.
Trade and all that sort of thing. And that was, I mean, recently I saw the Stiff Little Fingers. Well, I mean, about 4 or 5 years ago, and they're still pretty good.
Yeah,
Uh,
I didn't see them either, and I wish I'd seen them. I love the fact also you've referred to an Australian, the
Hunters
Hunters,
and Collectors.
and
Yeah.
because that's such an old. Only someone who's actually spent time in Australia would have known who they are, which I love.
But, but Mark Seymour is one of the best songwriters I've come across. I mean, and
I agree.
tremendous.
Yeah,
It's, I
totally.
mean, people compare them to Crowded House, but I think they're way better than Crowded House, I think, in terms of.
Yeah, I mean, there's some bands. There's another really like very obscure Australian band called Boom Crash Opera, who I think are better than In Excess. Way better in every way.
There was a band called Red Gum. There's an Australian band called Red Gum, which is from Adelaide. Amazing band.
Mhm.
It's the folkish, the folk rock, but amazing songwriting.
Yeah, I know them. They're great. Well, my wife's Australian, so she's indoctrinated me in the entire Australian music scene, and I mean Boom Crash Opera, who I think are exponentially greater than any Australian rock band that's come out of like including an NXS or anyone. We saw them in a tiny venue with 250 people, and then a few weeks later, they're playing in a hotel lobby bar, and they're not known at all, and they are so much better than everyone.
Well, I mean, when I was in Australia, two of my musical moments in Australia was were I accidentally happened upon the Crowded House concert at the Sydney Opera House. I happened to be there at that moment. It was the free last concert that they did before they came back and did several other farewell concerts. And the next year, sadly, Michael Hutchence died. So that was the
Yeah. Wow. It's a formidable year that. Yeah, everything changed. Anyway, Prashant, I'm going to see you next time. Thanks for everyone who's watching. And yeah, let's continue this conversation where we leave off this. And thanks for having us.